In this segment, we'll be taking a look at the civil rights movement through the 1960s. And we'll need to understand that working through the court system, mass protest, public opinion was changed, which secured the passage of significant civil rights legislation. We'll start with a march on Washington in 1963. John F. Kennedy had sent a civil rights bill to Congress, and Congress tabled it. That is, they refused to discuss it any longer. Dr. King jumped into action. He organized a march on Washington, D.C. to try to put pressure on Congress in order that they might pass this civil rights bill. On August 28th, 1963, Dr. King appeared before a crowd of nearly 250,000 people at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. The participants and viewers were incredibly moved by the speech, "I Have a Dream." This is the moment when public opinion began to really swing to support civil rights legislation. This is going to prove the power of nonviolent protest and how peaceful resistance can bring about change. This happened again in August of 1963, but then tragedy is going to strike with the assassination of John F. Kennedy in November of 1963. Lee Harvey Oswald, believed to be the lone gunman, targeted and assassinated President John F. Kennedy. Many people feared that this would bring an end to the civil rights movement, that the assassination of this man who spoke so eloquently in favor of civil rights was now dead. And we were left with a new president who was going to be unproven. And that man's name was Lyndon Johnson. He's the new president. And Lyndon Johnson's the guy on the left. Dr. King is on the right. But many people fear that since Lyndon Johnson was a Democrat from the state of Texas, deep in the South, they feared that this would be an end to civil rights. However, as it turns out, Lyndon Johnson was a very strong advocate for civil rights. In fact, some would argue that he's even a greater advocate of civil rights than John F. Kennedy ever was. In fact, Lyndon Johnson is the one who's going to be responsible for coercing or forcing Congress to pass the two most significant civil rights legislation pieces in the 1960s. You see, Lyndon Johnson wanted to create this thing that he called a great society, and he saw equal rights as part of this program of a great society. I try to quote him here, he says, "No society can be great if it keeps some of its people as second-class citizens." So Lyndon Johnson was willing to work to fight for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And with pressure that he put on Congress, Congress eventually passed this act. Keeping in mind the March on Washington, we begin to see a change. The act is going to prohibit discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and gender. It is also going to integrate all public accommodations. And by using the Interstate Commerce Clause in the Constitution, the law is going to be enforceable by Congress. It was a huge stretch, but a big push for equal rights. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was simply not enough. There were too many people, especially in the South, in the Deep South, who were not voting. And Dr. King is going to organize a march for voting rights. He organizes this march to raise awareness in Selma in 1965. The nonviolent protesters, as you can see on this image, were peacefully marching when they were literally attacked by the police with fire hoses and with dogs, live on television. This act of violence against a peaceful demonstration raised public awareness and drew a great deal of support in favor of a new voting rights law. After all these people wanted to do was vote. With the pressure again brought on Congress by Lyndon Johnson, we have the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This is going to ban voting and registration discrimination across the United States. Whereas once this was controlled by the state governments, now the national government is going to take control. It is going to outlaw literacy testing as a voting qualification. Federal registrars are going to be sent to the South to ensure that voters get registered. It's going to provide for U.S. Marshals, not the local sheriff, to investigate claims of discrimination. The result is going to be a huge increase in black voting all across the South. And again, it was Lyndon Johnson who coerced Congress and used his tactics to get this law passed. The ideologies of the civil rights movement, most of us know of civil disobedience. That is the refusal to obey an unjust law, to accept the consequences, to go ahead and allow yourself to go to jail, but refuse to obey an unjust law. This was professed by Dr. King as a form of nonviolent protest. Peaceful protest, also advocated by Martin Luther King, was to simply show up and be in opposition and not retaliate. Do not fight back. If you fight back, you are no longer the simple victim. Dr. King wanted to prove that human beings were being victimized here. And the more the public became aware of this, much like the muckraking journalism during the Progressive era, the more the public was aware, the more they would rise up and demand equality, even if they were not part of the civil rights movement itself. But not everybody was in favor of civil disobedience and nonviolence. Many grew very, very intolerant and impatient with the movement. And a more militant movement of especially the late 1960s, they had lost patience. It was called the Black Power movement. It was advocated by the Black Panthers and also the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X was a key speaker there. They had grown tired of Dr. King's nonviolent protest and felt that it was not acceptable to simply lay down and accept violent behavior, that retaliation was acceptable. When we consider the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, we'll recall that this was an organization that was founded in 1909 by many different Americans, including W.E.B. Du Bois, and they worked for political, social, and economic equality. The organization challenged segregation in the courts. Remember, the NAACP hired lawyers, provided lawyers to challenge these laws. After all, the Supreme Court, with the authority to declare a law unconstitutional, judicial review, is a great way to challenge these laws. Also, through congressional lobbying and challenging these laws in court, the NAACP continues to work for Americans of all colors, not just African Americans. When we consider the legacies of these protests, by interpreting its powers very broadly, the Supreme Court can reshape American society, and that changing public opinion was necessary in order for the government to respond with new legislation. We know that nonviolent protest now seems to get the most positive results from American society without the backlash of violent protests. And of course, the concepts of civil rights are still issues in politics today.